since the days of actually before the Bolsheviks, but from the Bolshevik Revolution, the first thing they did when this small group took over this massive Russia was create a security service. And they called themselves openly, "We are terrorists. Our job is to destroy any opposition to leadership." And so in the West, when we talk about national security, in Russia, it's always been about regime security. And those security services were the most important thing to the regime because it kept them in power.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, we're joined by former CIA officer John Sipher. John was once the head of the CIA's Russia House, and he spent most of his career hunting and recruiting Russian spies. On today's show, we look at Russian intelligence, and we look at some of the myths about their capabilities. I hope you like this episode. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
John, welcome to Secrets and Spies. It's great to have you on. Now, you spoke with Matt last time. This is the first time we've spoken together, so I'm glad we're finally doing this. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Pleasure to meet you.
Excellent. Well, John, for the uninitiated, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your 28-year career in the CIA, and then what led you to sort of focus so much on Russia?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, when I came in, it was still the Cold War, and I'd come out of graduate school and was looking to do something that I thought mattered. My parents were teachers, and I studied history and political science, and I wanted to do something that mattered, and looked at a variety of things and found myself going to the CIA. And I originally started thinking I would be an analyst for a few years and then leave to get a PhD or something. And instead, my sort of psychological profile and the people I got to meet when I first got into the sort of CIA 101 were the clandestine collectors side of the house. So the spy side of the CIA. There's an analytic side and a spy side of the two sort of main in the science and technology area. And it ended up being a wonderful career. I, learned languages and would go live overseas for a couple of years and in embassies. And early on, I was in Russia in the early years, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Eventually came back to headquarters and ran part of our Russia program, or all of our Russia program. And then, ended up in all kinds of places doing terrorism stuff in Pakistan and working in Indonesia and working on domestic things with the FBI, counter-espionage cases. And so, your life ends up going by really fast, and it's really enjoyable to sort of dig in and learn a new culture and prepare to go live somewhere overseas. And you have to really like the people, the foreigners and people you're working for. And so all of a sudden, 28, 30 years goes by. And and then since then, I've tried to figure out what to do with myself. I did consulting for a while and then eventually created a company similar to what you do to try to work with Hollywood and make films and shows that are a little more authentic about the intelligence community.
Yes, indeed. But maybe we'll sort of go into that a little bit later because, authenticity in film when it comes to espionage is sort of sadly lacking most of the time. And I find the more I learn about the real world, the less I find fiction satisfying. But there are some good things out there, and I'm hoping that in the future, we'll be involved with making some good things ourselves. So moving away a little bit from film, can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like to operate in Russia, especially given its reputation as like one of the most hostile counterintelligence environments?
Yeah, and we can talk about, the history and what led up to it, but it's been that way for decades, if not centuries, sort of the autocracy and the repression and the paranoia and stuff. So that, we in the United States, the FBI is the counterintelligence agency that's supposed to keep, foreigners from stealing U.S. secrets. But in Russia, it is sort of, it's not just a value add small piece of the bureaucracy. It is sort of the overwhelming part. It's the sword and shield is what the KGB called itself. And so they put incredible resources both into the stuff we're going to probably end up talking about what they do overseas in terms of disinformation and subversion and stuff. But at home, Just massive. The FBI people who work on counterintelligence in the United States is maybe, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 people. In Russia, it's hundreds of thousands of people. So living and working in Russia, it's a different place. Most CIA people who are overseas, our job is to meet people, develop relationships, figure out whether they have access to secrets that the U.S. government can't get any other way, and whether they might be motivated or have a reason to want to help the United States and give us those secrets. In Russia, it's almost impossible because you're followed all the time. It's not hyperbole that when I was there, I had surveillance every day, all night, teams outside my house. My house was bugged. My house had audio and video in it, even in the bathrooms and things. And so there's no secrets. They're following you. There's stories of them. You turn a corner and they don't see what you're doing. They bring dogs behind to sniff and see if you put a dead drop down or what have you. So it's a very repressive environment and a difficult place to work. So it tends to be a place where we run spies, just a few people who can operate in that environment, the kind of people that can only give us like the biggest, most important secrets, because you don't want to jeopardize someone for something that's not really worth it, because it's a dangerous environment to operate. But it's a heady place when you have success. And we use disguise and subterfuge and all sorts of ways to try to handle those few cases. But the idea that we're out meeting lots of people and developing them and as new spies makes it almost impossible in a place like Russia.
Yeah, yeah. And I can only assume that's getting harder and harder now with like biometrics and all
Yes,
that
of
kind of
course.
stuff and CCTV. It must be very difficult.
It's one thing when you're trained to see surveillance, how they're following, how they might be moving around you and manipulate them so that you might be able to find a niche of secrecy where you can do something, put down a drop or meet someone quickly or whatever. Nowadays, it's almost scarier because, back then I could control what I see and what I know. But now if you don't see surveillance, you're like, oh, what does that mean? Does that mean they have me on video? Does that mean there's drones above me doing me knowing that you manipulate them is harder and harder in this new world for sure.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So, talking a little bit about the Russian intelligence services, how would you describe the mission and the mindset of Russia's intelligence services today, which is obviously the the FSB, SVR, and GRU?
What's interesting to me is that it hasn't changed much. And so when I talk to groups and students and things, the history gives us a real sense of what it's like. It's since the days of actually before the Bolsheviks, but from the Bolshevik Revolution, the first thing they did when this small group took over this massive Russia was create a security service. And they called themselves openly, "We are terrorists. Our job is to destroy any opposition to leadership." And so in the West, when we talk about national security, in Russia, it's always been about regime security. And those security services were the most important thing to the regime because it kept them in power. More important than the army, more important than the foreign service, any of those type of things. And so the Russian security services now, in many ways, are similar. Vladimir Putin's a career KGB officer. The security services are even bigger. They're more involved in repression domestically. As we've seen, they're involved in causing chaos and problems in Europe and in the United States, using sort of active measures and disinformation and covert means. But it came from the very beginning when Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, and those guys took over the Bolshevik regime. Those are fake names. Those are their underground names because they were essentially terrorists fighting the czars. And so when they took over, they knew that they had this massive country, this small group, and they couldn't take on the powers that be in the world, the Germanys and the French and the British services. And so they had to operate like terrorists, asymmetric warfare. Look for the weakness in your enemy. Try to use lies, disinformation, subterfuge, all of those things to weaken your enemy from the inside. And so that's been sort of how those services have worked for years and years. Many of their greatest successes throughout, the 20th century were against their allies because it was sort of a nonstop war against the West. And so nowadays, same thing. It's political warfare. It's constantly trying to keep adversaries off balance. And so maybe new tools. They can use social media now. You can use cyber attacks and things, but the playbook is the same.
Yeah. And how is Moscow's use of intelligence as a frontline tool of statecraft different from how the West used intelligence? Because there are a lot of people, especially on the internet, who make out that the CIA is this sort of all-knowing, all ruthless kind of organization that works in the same way as Russia, but it does appear to be very different.
Yeah, sometimes the CIA benefits, and so does MI6. So that we're all over the place, and we know those things. And insiders, maybe it's best if I pretend like that's true. But Western services, almost as a whole, the goal is to collect secrets, to collect intelligence, give it to a professional analytic class, who then puts that together using expertise and using all that intelligence, and not just secret intelligence from spies, but from overhead collection and diplomats and military attachés and experts and scientists, put that all together for policymakers to make smart policy. So it's collection analysis. The Russians, forever, it's always been about service of keeping the leadership in power and using subversion, using these tools sort of openly in sort of action. That term they use for what they do, active measures, the term active. It's like using your services to actively keep your enemies off base. So yes, they do run spies, they do collect intelligence, but the main thing they do is use this sort of overt political warfare techniques that we'll talk about. And so when people talk about CIA, yeah, you see that all the time. People push back on things, and it is true to a certain extent. So after World War II, I mean, the thing is, the Russians had security services long before. They were running spies in our White House, in our security services, in our military, in our atomic program, all through the British services, as you know, have spies, all when we were supposedly allies. Mm-hmm. Through the 1930s, they had legals all around the world collecting intelligence. We had nothing. The U.S. had no intelligence service. We had an intelligence service that worked with the military in World War II, and then afterwards, in 1947, created the CIA. And at that time, there was such a fear that World War III could break out at any time. And Eisenhower said, all I want from this new organization is 24 hours notice of when the Russians are coming across the border in Germany. And we had no sources in Moscow. We had really no sense of Stalin's massive armies and what it meant for Europe. And so the thought was back then, there was a number of reports, the Doolittle report and others, that said, we have to play like the Russians do. This is protecting against World War III. We need to do and we just come out of World War II, paramilitary stuff, drop people behind the lines. It led into the 1950s, early 60s, this, overthrowing governments, using these active things. And I think for a number of reasons over time, we learned that, number one, democracies aren't as good at that as autocracies are, that it created a lot of blowback and problems. You can see it even now in places like Iran and in Latin America, where the CIA was involved in things that, led to us being looked at as sort of enemies. And eventually we realized that what the Russians did was asymmetric warfare. It's a warfare of the weak against the strong. If you're the weak, you have to use all of these dark, ugly tools to play on the stage. Whereas the U.S. eventually was so huge and powerful that rather than try to use asymmetric tools, we should operate sort of overtly and use our power and our power of persuasion and things. And so by the 1970s, I think, our foreign policy had realized that our security services were moving in the wrong way and had created problems for us, both domestically and abroad. And there was a series of reforms, very strong reforms, putting the intelligence services under congressional oversight, for example. They weren't before. They just did whatever the president wanted them. If the president wants the CIA to do things like they did in the past of overthrow governments, there was now a new process for that. They had to put it in writing. It had to go to the congressional top committees. So the CIA that I came into in the mid-early 80s, it was sort of a reform CIA. Those kind of constant psychological games and overthrowing things were not there. It was much more, a lot of lawyers, more focused on collection, more focused on sort of, keeping our overseers informed. And so a lot of times when people say, oh, the CIA does all those things, in a certain sense it did. Nowadays, much less so. And, we talk, if you're looking for overthrowing countries, it's done overtly now. It's the U.S. military going into Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not the CIA doing some nefarious thing.
Thank you for that. So what are the biggest myths or misconceptions about Russian intelligence capabilities that you'd like to correct? And how should democracies defend against their aggression?
I think it's a great question. And I think part of the problem is Russia has been successful with this political warfare of using all of these tools of disinformation. So, one of the terms that we talk about is reflexive control. It's a Russian strategic concept that aims at you try to manipulate your opponent's decision-making process so that they make choices that are in the manipulator's favor and lead to their own disadvantage. And so we've seen that a lot, not just the Trump administration, the Biden administration before that, the Obama administration before that, the Bush administration. Putin has used sort of bluster, lies, and things to sort of suggest that they are hugely powerful, that, there's nothing you can do to stop them, that they're owed, a zone of Ukraine and these places, a variety of things. And so Western leaders have consistently, because we're democratic and we have sort of worldwide responsibilities, tend to think, oh, it'll come around. Russia will want what we want eventually. If we just appease them eventually, maybe we'll get there. Well, I think we've learned now that Putin's not going to change. You can't appease him. You're not going to be able to make him think like you do. But the problem is we've often, when he pushes and does something, and whether it's Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or even in Europe and assassinations and stuff, we've often not responded. We forget that we are the much larger, more powerful country. We've allowed this smaller country to use those dark tools of subversion to sort of keep us from acting. And so I think one of the biggest things is realizing our weight of our allies and our own power and our own economic power and using it. And sadly, my view is in Ukraine is the place to do that. We had a real opportunity. Putin stepped into a situation where he's completely, screwed the pooch and really stuck in a bad place. And I think in some ways we've sort of let him go because we've bought into this false narrative that it's inevitable and they're super powerful and there's nothing we can do. And we've seen that that's not really true.
Indeed. It's a big problem. And I think, with the current Trump administration as well, it feels like Ukraine is sort of becoming a bit of a lost opportunity because Putin sort of stepped up his efforts in the last few months. And I don't know where we're going with that at the moment.
Yeah, I know. I mean, he certainly has, but if you look at it from the bigger picture, it's a complete debacle for him. He's stuck. So the notion was that they were going to overrun Ukraine, and he's due countries on his border to be, supplicant to the Kremlin. I mean, he loses more people in a week, and for a long time it was in a day, than the United States lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. I mean, you're talking every day losing more people than we lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. He's made their economy sort of weak for decades to come. He's made them supplicant to China. So many people, he's had to be more repressive at home, jail more people, sort of turn things against him. So, like a dictator who's been in power for that long, it's not legitimate. He doesn't have voters to support what he's doing. He has to just double down. He has almost no choice. And so it surprises me for the last year or two, like the media has continually said, well, Russia's bigger. It's going to eventually win. Like there's nothing much to do. They're moving forward. Well, they're moving forward at a pace that would take them 150 years to get all the stuff that they claimed they were going to get in 3 days. And so now still is a good time to support and help the Ukrainians. And it looks like the Europeans are doing that more, in fact, than the U.S. is at this point. And that's unfortunate and sad for me as an American.
Yeah. Europe is doing what it can. I think at the moment we lack certain weapon systems that Ukraine desperately needs. And obviously the U.S., the people to supply that. And that's been a bit sort of up and down, hasn't it, since Trump came in?
Yeah.
Let's take a break and be right back with more. You've written that Russia's history is one of perpetual weakness disguised as might. So how does that shape its politics and foreign policy today?
Well, to go back to that notion of asymmetric warfare, and I know it sounds boring, but it's sort of Russia's ambitions have always outpaced their capabilities. So there's always a gap between what they want and what they can achieve. And so that's led to this different way of making wars: nonstop political warfare, lies, disinformation, confuse, paralyze. It's sort of war on the cheap. And so it's a country that, some academics have talked about it as sort of an empire that's never became a country. It's always about moving forward, creating larger things, keeping their countries around them tied to them. And so that's created a foreign policy that is sort of focused on that. I mean, if you look at Russian growth, I mean, since the reign of like Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, Russia has expanded almost until recent years at an average rate of like 50 square miles per day for hundreds of years. And it's taken in different ethnic groups and different things. And so it's never solidified itself into Russia as a sort of a state that is for Russians. And it's always sort of had this messianic view that it has to take these other places. And because it's never truly powerful enough to do that, it's used these tricks, these war on the cheap that we're talking about, against it. And so what's I think happened is that's become such standard, using the security services, using these sort of games, that they've never focused on the things that truly make power, economic power, legitimacy, making things economically that matter to other countries, and building alliances. I mean, does it have any real friends? I mean, now they're pretending as if China's their friend, but I think most Russians are incredibly racist and look down at China, even though China's much more powerful than they are now. And so I think they've sort of set themselves in a really bad place, and it's Vladimir Putin who's tied them to that. He's created a system where he's created no successors. There's no system now. There's no system of following up. I think I was there in the 90s, right, and worked in that area in the end of the Cold War, before the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was such a concern that Russia would become like Yugoslavia, that, oh my God, if Russia, we have to support the Soviet Union in keeping it together in some fashion. George Bush sort of did that because if it breaks apart, it could be the most horrific civil war in history, like as bad as Yugoslavia, but on this massive global scale. And it didn't happen that way. And so there's always a fear that would happen. But frankly, Putin's put them in a position where it still could happen. There's no succession plan. There's no process of legitimately picking new leaders and new systems. And so, he's stepped in Ukraine, and, he's repressed the people. And we've seen it over time in places like East Germany and Egypt and Libya and other places that, the dictator's incredible power until the day he's not, and the people eventually come around and turn on those leaders. And if that happens in Russia, it's going to be horrific, I think.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very similar to sort of the death of Stalin. I mean, we've seen the comedy movie about it, but it's
great.
not a comedy. Yeah. It's a great film, but in the reality wasn't so great. But I worry about what happens next, because Putin, he's in his 70s, I think, so he's only got so long left, probably. He probably lives quite a high-stress life, I imagine, doing what he's doing. So, so eventually nature will take over. And, I don't know what happens next. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what might happen next. But
geez, not that's the problem, is he's set it up so that there's no means of knowing. Are there groups inside Russia that are secretly plotting to like figure out what to do? Or is he using those massive security services to make sure that that's not happening and that those people are caught and punished? That's always been the main focus of their security services. It's been domestic at home to keep the leadership in power. So I think it's anybody's guess. And it's really unfortunate, actually, for the people of Russia, who've always had essentially bad leaders, that have made their lives miserable.
If Russia makes almost nothing the world wants, what does that mean for its sort of legitimacy and long-term stability?
I think it also goes back to our thing is real power in the modern age is having friends, having allies, having a powerful economy, engaging with the world. And you see, frankly, right now the biggest challenge to the United States is the growth of China. But if you look at China and you look at Russia, China is the winner of the 21st century and Russia is the loser of the 21st century. Russia has decided that the economic way the world works, the global way that things come together, is not in their interest. So they just want to destroy everything. They want to create problems. They want to create chaos so they can keep their small little area of the world in control where they are. China, on the other hand, wants to own the future. They want to, they're not looking to undercut the commercial sort of trade around the world because they want to be the main player in that. And so those are very different ways of looking at the world. Russia is just trying to, undercut everything. And so what is the future for that? For Vladimir Putin, as the dictator, it keeps him in power, right? So for him, I get it. He stays rich. His cronies stay rich. He stays in power. But the future of Russia is essentially the thing that's being thrown away there. Whereas China, despite all of its problems, is at least, trying to own the future. Sadly, since Xi has been in power, he's sort of undercut that ability of what is the future, how do new leaders come in, what is the succession plan, which could be awful too. But so, Russia, what do they make? I mean, it's almost, they make security services, they make means to repress their people. They have brilliant computer people and internet folks and can do lots of stuff, but a lot of them have actually fled during the Ukraine war. And so I think it's a real sad state for the future of Russia.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you talked about it a little bit earlier historically about how the intelligence services in Russia are designed for sort of keeping the regime in power. How has Putin sort of personally sort of weaponized the security state so he can stay in power?
Well, frankly, if you look at the people who are close to Putin, almost all of them are former intelligence officers. They're all people he knew. I know I went to a meeting at CIA when Director Burns was the chief. This is after I'd retired, after the Ukraine war started. And one of the things that he, passed on to our group, we were talking about, he was bringing some outsiders in to talk about Russia, was that, the decision-making group around Putin that decided on whether to go into Ukraine or not was literally like 3 people, 2-3 people. Even the foreign minister had no idea what they were planning to do. And these were all former KGB people. It's that mentality. So they have the mentality that they understand power. They understand what the state needs. They don't need all of this Western view that there should be lots of voices, there should be media, there should be other institutions. So they've recreated what the KGB had, but almost more powerful. Like in the Soviet Union, the KGB was a sword and shield, incredibly powerful, more powerful in the sense than the military because they had KGB people inside the military to make sure it followed the lines and stuff. But it was controlled by the Politburo. It was controlled by the Communist Party. So there was not a single person, but a group inside the Communist Party that made sure that the security services were under their control. Nowadays, the security services sort of are their policy, are their foreign policy. It's Putin, a few of his former intelligence cronies, and the intelligence services.
Yeah. And defectors sort of describe him as isolated and paranoid. So how does that affect sort of decision making, including his decision to invade Ukraine, which was, as we're saying, a big mistake and a blunder?
A terrible blunder. In some ways, I would look even not just to Russia for that. I think that's not an unusual thing we've seen in history. When dictators and people take over and stay in power for a long period of time, there's a series of things that just naturally happen. One is, since you're not legitimate, your power is illegitimate, there's no voters, there's no feedback mechanism, you become more and more paranoid because you have to keep yourself in power. And so you become more and more repressive. You have to make sure there's no opposition to you. You don't know what's happening out there. You're not getting that feedback. And then also because you're in power longer and longer, those people who are around you, they depend on you for their power and oftentimes for their money in Russia. That's how they keep in power. They are in a position where they don't want to necessarily tell you the truth, or they don't want to be in a position to say something that you don't want to hear because then they lose their ability for power or money, or even worse, in a place like that, you get arrested, thrown in jail, or worse. And so as time goes by, those kind of dictators, and we've seen it in Libya and all these other places, the repression, you must wake up every day thinking, okay, what's happening out there? I don't know. I just have to keep an iron fist. I just need to get through today. And then what's happening? So you lose that ability to, think about the future. You lose that ability to rely on other people, other institutions. And Putin, aside from specifically Russian things, I think that's what he's done in terms of just being a authoritarian in power for that long.
I was reading Christopher Steele's book, and he apparently he says that Putin was haunted by the death of Gaddafi, and apparently he's watched that tape endless times, and it kind of keeps him awake at night.
I think that fits. That's the thing. Is like another example. He served in Dresden and East Germany when he was in the KGB. He spent the first 10 years or whatever of his time in the KGB in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, doing domestic things, following foreigners, following up, opposition groups, that type of stuff. And then his first chance to be in the sort of more elite overseas cadre, but it wasn't really overseas, was East Germany. And it wasn't even in East Berlin. It was in Dresden. And he was in a place where he was involved sort of in, East German and Russian sort of smuggling networks and dealing with Palestinian terrorists and that type of thing. And so, he knows what happened in East Germany, right? So he was, and I mean, how you psychologically, you believe you're in the most important institution, the power of a great superpower, and all of a sudden your country falls apart and you're there. He saw East Germany, again, which was probably arguably even more cracked down, more powerful. The people had no ability to speak back. They had the Stasi was probably the most repressive and successful, if you will, security service in history. And all of a sudden that incredible power, like just with a little crack, the people came out in the streets, and within a short period of time, the whole thing fell apart. And so that's got to be in your head. He was in East Germany when that fell apart. He was in the KGB when the Soviet Union fell apart. And so he understands that power is fleeting and that if you don't keep that power and crack down, you could lose it. In fact, in his autobiography, he even talks about that. He's, the famous story, I'm sure you guys all know it, of when he was in Dresden and when East Germany was falling apart, a bunch of protesters and people surrounded the consulate there in Dresden, and he went outside and, with a gun and says, "We're armed in here," and sort of went back to his people in the consulate to contact Moscow for orders, and was told Moscow, they said, "What are the orders?" And they said, "Sir, we've contacted Moscow over and over, but Moscow is silent." And he says in his book, My objective ever since that time is if I was in a position, Moscow would not be silent. When it needs to use repression, it would. And so that, I think, is he knows that it could turn in an instant. And that's why he's stuck in a place like Ukraine. It's like, if you actually give up and say that you're losing or that you've made this mistake, boom, that could be the end of you overnight.
Yeah. Does Putin have any kind of fear of NATO? Because, I mean, people like critics of the West, I put it that way, love to blame the Ukraine invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, on NATO expansionism. And, what are Putin's sort of views on NATO?
Well, like in the States, we start to see sort of our political discussion turn, like, the Trump folks start to say things I think are crazy, but you say them enough times and you maybe start to believe this stuff. But Putin either knows or should know, because in the early years of his when he was he would dealt with NATO. Russians were part of the NATO decision-making process. They were in Brussels. They were working with us, things. He knows that NATO's not really a threat, that it's a defensive alliance. In a sense, NATO threatens Russia like a lock threatens a thief, right? I mean, it's like what it threatens is his desire to push forward and move into other places. What it threatens is that he can't control places like Georgia and Estonia and Ukraine and places like that to get his way. It doesn't threaten Moscow and Russia, but he has to create that narrative, that false narrative that it's a constant threat to Russia, because you have to tell your people that, like, if it wasn't for my strength, you need me because of my power, because NATO wants to take us over. So they've created that disinformation narrative for so long that, so many, they may believe it at this point, but it's just like, the problem is we in the West keep saying, well, maybe the NATO thing is a problem to them. Maybe we have to try to accommodate this. But in some ways, that just continues the problem. I think it's just a disinformation narrative that has become so powerful in Russia that they can't pull out of it.
Yeah, I agree. Why did so many Western analysts overestimate Russia's strength and underestimate Ukraine's will to fight?
I think that's a great question. And so let me try to bear with me, because I think there's a number of things here that happen. It's really interesting. And I think we should talk about it, because we can't afford to get that wrong with China and Taiwan, because it could be a horrible thing. And I think our analysts have often got things wrong in terms of will to fight in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as in Ukraine. So first of all, I mean, it's really surprising in a sense that we immediately assumed Russian power and Russian success in Ukraine, because we have numerous examples of defenders winning, right? Countries that were worried about their own survival. I mean, we in Vietnam, we were the powerful country. Vietnam just had not to lose in order to win. I mean, and very similarly in Afghanistan and Iraq, those were much weaker powers than the United States, and the West was in there and eventually sort of failed in what they were doing. So in a certain sense, we should have understood that, a country that worries about its own survival and it's a defender is in a strong position. We've got lots of examples of that. But also the confidence in Russian power is like a real surprise, because a lot of Westerners have direct experience in Ukraine, but there was no Western analysts, military people with direct experience in Russia. So I don't know. We've created this view of Russian power and what they're doing, even though we've seen, Russian corruption and problems, rather than, we have people who've worked in Ukraine, but that could also be due to some of our bureaucratic divisions, right? So the analysts who look at Ukraine and places weren't there. The analysts sit back in Washington. It's the operators that it worked with Ukraine. So is there a problem because our analysts are not getting the information of what operators are learning in the field? And to go back to the thing about Iraq and Afghanistan, like U.S. generals repeatedly ran up to Capitol Hill to explain how successful they were in preparing Iraqi and Afghan troops, how that they've been training them and giving money and giving weapons. But when push came to shove, they essentially, ran away or did nothing. Like, so our ability to understand the willingness to fight and to say things are a real problem that I think that needs to be fixed. And then maybe another piece is that intelligence agencies don't really collect on their friends and allies, right? Our focus is on all of our threats. So we have huge processes focused on Russia, Iran, China, terrorism, these other kind of things, but there's almost like no real experts on Ukraine. And so when the push came to shove, we were making decisions on what Ukraine would do or how long it would last or how it would fight without real expertise. You note that the one real expert, Timothy Snyder, got it right. He knew. So I think there's a number of things, both bureaucratic and just in terms of our sort of view of ourselves of understanding these things that failed pretty miserably.
Yeah. And do you think this analytic failure then led to delay in military support for Ukraine and potentially cost lives and even territory?
Well, yeah, that's the consequences. At the time where we could have realized that we could have doubled down and helped and got specific weapons, there's like, it's inevitable that Russia's going to overwhelm them. If we give them weapons, it's going to be just throwing them into failure and those kind of things. And so the analysis really mattered. And what's frustrating for me is a lot of those analysts that were completely wrong are still the one that the media run to and give quotes and do things that, you can still be a talking head even if you're wrong all the time.
Yeah, and you could even be a YouTube star as well. I've seen plenty of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, indeed. So what lessons should the intelligence community sort of take forward, especially in assessing sort of morale and capability in future conflicts like Taiwan? Because you've mentioned Taiwan earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think bureaucratically, we have to spend some time looking at our allies, like maybe not spying on them in the sense that we do with Russia or China, but, investing in, working with Taiwan and Taiwanese military and finding a way to, like there's probably U.S. military people who work on the ground with the Taiwanese military, but are they then sharing those learnings and whatever with analysts back in Washington? I don't think so. I think they're just doing their day-to-day thing and it's not integrated like that. That's one thing. I think just the hubris of thinking we can get away with whatever we want is all, one of the things I think with Russia, for example, is we failed to listen to countries that understand Russia better than we do, right? Ukraine understands Russia better than we do. The Baltic countries, the Finns, the Swedes have been dealing with them. They've been more effective at dealing with Russian disinformation and political games, much more than we have. But we tend to think, well, we understand better and try to dictate. I mean, even in places like Ukraine, I think we were tremendously helpful to them intelligence-wise in the early days prior to and in the early days of the invasion. But still, there's some of that American, like they listen to us. I've seen it with our Pentagon people. No, you shouldn't, you shouldn't, go this way. You should go that way because that's how we would do it. And so, I mean, Americans sometimes have to get off their high horse a little bit and listen to others.
Yeah, it's funny actually with the Ukraine thing. One of the things I noticed in the early days was there was a lot of sort of push to give sort of NATO integrated technology to Ukraine. And I always wondered why there was no effort to buy up all the MiGs around the world and maybe give F-16s to people who have the MiGs and give all the MiGs to Ukraine because they know how to use MiGs rather than retrain all your pilots on F-16s. I just never understood that. It was really weird.
No, I think that's right. I think there was some effort at that, but yeah. And, to be cynical, I mean, there's also, I think, people who realize there's an opportunity to make money and to give away some of our equipment that we're not using, then use that money that supposedly is for Ukraine to update our kit and stuff. So I don't know. There's a variety of things there but if we strategically believe that there was a window of opportunity for Ukraine to actually win and for Russia to actually lose, we would have overcome those things. But instead, I think this is part of the analytic problem is, because it's inevitable that Russia win, they're bigger. But Frank, we're bigger and we lose. So
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you see a path to outright Ukrainian victory, or are we headed toward a sort of frozen conflict? And what would it take for the Russian system to sort of truly break with regards to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's again the thing is the ability to predict when places fall apart has not been terribly good, but we have lots of cases where they did. So, ultimate Ukrainian victory, if you're talking about actually taking back all of the territory, requires Russian loss and realizing they lost, like Putin falling or a new system having to come in. So I think that's something that the West should think about, should try to push. And, we talked earlier about in the early days when the United States tried to play like Russia and we did psychological warfare and political warfare and we tried to overthrow countries and we tried to dump money into political parties in other countries. And we sort of lost that ability and don't do that much anymore. I mean, this is almost the time to do that. The President of the United States almost ought to sit down with Vladimir Putin and say, I'm going to make it my mission. If you don't pull out of Ukraine, I'm going to make it my mission to destroy you politically, to make sure you're out of power. Because everything you want is to stay in power, in control. I'm going to waste money. I'm going to find ways to support any Russian political opposition. We're going to dump information into your country. We're going to dump money into your country to people to try to overthrow you. We're going to use every, bit that we can, either secretly or overtly, to do that. And, one of the things, if you grow up in a security service and you use the security services as your main weapon, you tend to think that places like CIA in the West do the same thing and can do the same thing. And I think that kind of threat would be something that he would probably understand more. So yeah, Ukraine winning, I think Ukraine in some ways is winning. I mean, there's still a democratic, sovereign country that's willing to fight for itself. Taking back stuff is going to depend on a clear Russian loss and a loss for Putin. I mean, I lived in Finland too and worked in Finland, and I can remember in the early '90s and the late '80s talking to the Baltic people before that, when they were still part of the Soviet Union, saying, the problem is when push came to shove, we didn't fight against Stalin when they tried to and Lenin when they tried to take over our countries, but the Finns killed so many Russians. They fought they lost a lot of land, but they maintained their sovereignty and their democratic way of life, and we didn't. And we learned from that. And so, I mean, I think Ukraine is doing that now. I mean, history books in Ukraine 30 years now will talk about the people who sacrificed for their independence.
If Russia remains sort of under security service rule, is containment the only realistic strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the realistic strategy is not buying the lies and is pushing back against it. To a certain extent, because essentially, if you actually care about Russia's future, this is not, Putin is not the way to go. But of course, there's going to be people that aren't as aggressive on this as me that are going to say, hey, again, if you try to interfere in Russia, you could create a separate set of problems. So I do think the West, probably the most sensible thing is to re-strengthen our alliances, refocus on, maybe, like you said, old-fashioned sort of deterrence, keep them at bay while you focus on other things. Because, again, in the larger picture at the end of the day, China's a much bigger challenge for the West over a longer period of time. Russia's an irritant, a problem. Just they continue to try to do bad things, but it's also, at the end of the day, an economy the size of Portugal, and it's not necessarily a long-term real threat to the West.
Indeed. Yeah.
It's a threat to it is a threat to the West, but it's not something we shouldn't be able to handle.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think a post-Putin Russia could ever be less adversarial, or are we now facing a generational struggle no matter who is in charge, possibly because of what I call Putinism, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, the the likelihood is, people around, if he sort of dies, the people around, or it might be falling, it's the people around him that understand where the levels of power are and where the money is, and sort of would pull in behind him and try to take the reins. And so Putinism in some fashion would probably continue. And Russia's history is not something that gives us a lot of happiness about what might be happening. They've had czars and they've had Bolshevik commissars, and now they have Putin. And it's always been an autocracy. It's always been repressive. It's always had secret police. It's always treated its neighbors, poorly. It's always treated its citizens poorly. I'd like to think the educated Russian populace at some point would not put up with it, and there is a much better future for Russia. I think we shouldn't write off Russia, but it's not a slam dunk for sure.
No, indeed. And what do you think the biggest mistake Western leaders could make with regards to Russia in the next decade?
Is continuing to sort of fall for this. Like even today in the paper, there's talk about Europe using Russian money to support Ukraine, using Russian money, Russian banks. And Putin talked about if they do, there'll be terrible retaliation and we have nuclear weapons and on and on. It's the same bluster and the same sort of bully stuff that has, gone on and on and on. And, he rarely follows through with these things because, they win. We tend to back down before we even realize that, hey, in this situation, we're in a more powerful position. So, I mean, one quote unquote good thing to come from this is, prior really to the 2022 invasion, and certainly prior to 2014, there was always this view that, we should just like give in some to Putin. We should deal with him. It's going to come around. There are bigger problems. Let's if Putin says he wants the thing and he pushes back, we'll sort of accommodate that. I think now there is at least an agreement and understanding among Western leaders that Putin's Putin. He's an enemy. He sees us as an enemy. He's at a nonstop war with us. This notion that we should just negotiate with him and give in to his demands, I think that's over. So I think in some ways if Putin stays in power, the West is better prepared to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, one random question. If you were in a position of, well, not necessarily authority, but advisorship, what would you do? What would you recommend that maybe the president should do about Russia at the moment?
I think double down on Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting them. Ukraine is where Putin is weakest. It's, he's got his foot caught in a trap, and we shouldn't open the trap and let him out of it. I think we shouldn't be afraid of Putin falling. I think Western politicians, American politicians over the years are so afraid that, it's almost all about stability. The situation we have, we understand it. Let's keep it that way. We're afraid to sort of like to rattle the cage for fear it might be worse. But in this case, what's going to be worse than the way Vladimir Putin has treated the West and his own people for that matter. And so I'm sort of the double down school, help the Ukrainians. Putin has made a terrible mistake. Now's the time to take advantage of that mistake.
Let's take a break and be right back with more. So, John, there are so many myths about the CIA, some from Hollywood, some from history, and some actively spread by Russia. Are there any particular ones that bother you the most and that distort the public understanding of what the CIA does?
Yeah, in a certain sense. I work for the organization. I consider myself an ethical and moral person. I'm probably more of the left than I'm more of the right. But there tends to be a view, and some of it's natural in a democracy, that it's a secret organization. Therefore, people can put all their fears and things into they must be up to no good. I think some of our recent directors, General Hayden, for example, others have said, we have an obligation because we are a secret organization and will continue to be and need secrecy to do our work. we do have an obligation to the extent that we can to educate the American people and tell people what we do so they understand it. And those of us inside, yeah, it was a secret organization. We operated, trying to accomplish our goals and pushed our authorities to the extent that we could. But if you talk to all operatives, almost all of us have this same view. It's called the Washington Post test. Like, if my mother or grandmother saw, if one of the things we were doing leaked and came out and was on the front page of the Washington Post, would we be embarrassed by it? Could we justify it to our mother? Like, is it? And I have to say, and I've heard others say that, there's a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of sort of legitimate critiques and criticisms of the CIA, but I don't think I ever was involved in anything that I couldn't defend or think that was sensible and whatever. So there are these just sort of automatic views that we must be up to no good, which frustrate me because, like, there's lots of good people, lots of educated people. Why do you assume that a large group of educated people would want to do something bad, that we would want to hurt people or whatever it is that you create? Like, we live next door. We're normal people like anybody else. And so that sort of frustrates me. Some of it's understandable. Like, just people love conspiracy theories. They love stories, and it's an easy way to, the CIA must be doing things. But the realistic thing, I have a podcast with a colleague of mine, Jerry O'Shea, who works with me on this, the film stuff I'm doing, the Hollywood stuff too. And then we have another New Yorker writer who works with us. And what we try to do is look at conspiracy theories and either debunk them or say what makes sense in the conspiracy theories and talk to people. It's called Mission Implausible. And one of the things that oftentimes is the best answer to, like, these incredible conspiracy theories is, how the hell would you actually pull them off? Like, the CIA at the end of the day is a bureaucratic organization. You have to get approval from people above you and below you, and there's lawyers, and there's, everything is written down, and it's a bureaucratic organization. And sort of the notion that we could, like, go murder, like, a U.S. president. Like, I mean, it's like, how exactly would that go? How exactly could that be kept secret inside? Like, so many of our secrets have come out. They become into the press and the media. That's one of the reasons I can talk publicly. I do these kind of things because there's not, there's certainly secret work going on now, but there's not these, horrific long-term secrets. I worked in the CIA for 30 years. If I knew the CIA was involved in trying to kill President Kennedy, I'd be out now talking about it, screaming to the, like, real places, real bureaucracies with lots of people can't do these incredibly complicated conspiracies, and they can't keep secrets forever. It's just the way of the world. But, people love to assume they can.
Yeah, indeed. A lot of people assume that the CIA is sort of like the mirror of Russia, because obviously Russia at the moment is very famous for assassinating people. I mean, if you're a Russian, you don't want to be near a window currently. And a lot of people assume that that's what the CIA do. And I had a very educated friend one day she was talking to me about my podcast, and I was like, how could you speak to so-and-so? They must, how many people have they killed? And I said, well, I don't think they've killed anybody, And she was sort of influenced by, like, the Bourne films, thinking that Treadstone was, like, a real thing and stuff. And it was crazy.
Well, it's funny to go back to one of the famous sort of conspiracies that the CIA was involved in killing JFK, Kennedy. That conspiracy, it's funny, like, in fact, the Stone film is based on a conspiracy that was pushed and created by the Russian intelligence services.
Yes, talk to us about this,
The Russians look for our weaknesses and our problems. We saw in our 2016 election and on. What they do is it's not hard. You look at the United States, you see what bad actors say, you see the conspiracy theories, and you just amplify them and push them and whatever. And so it was easy for the Russians to say, if I just put out a little bit of this information on this thing, people will grab it and run with it. And so, a lot of the stuff that people still believe on the Kennedy assassinations, that was actually a Russian disinformation campaign. So it's not a hard game.
Yeah. Well, talk to us a bit about, like, Russian disinformation, because from my understanding, they kind of look for people. They obviously look for an issue that's, a domestic issue, and then they try and find commentators from that country or that region who are about that, and then they kind of give them a bit of a boost, from my understanding. They don't necessarily create the conspiracy theory, but they kind of boost the ones that are domestically there.
Well, I mean, throughout the history, sometimes they created the theory. Like, there's the whole thing where the Pentagon created AIDS to, kill black people in Africa. This was a created fake conspiracy by the Russians, by the Soviets, to push into a newspaper in India and then amplify and push it up through the system. And there's still people today who believe these conspiracy theories. There's people today who still believe fake conspiracy theories created by the Tsarist security service, the Okhrana, about the worldwide Jewish cabal that are
That's
running
it.
the world.
Yeah.
But now you're right. So there's different ways of doing this. There's the useful idiot way that we see this with in the United States. Some very popular right-wing podcasters were getting, incredible money from what looked like a Canadian business, but essentially it was Russian money. Was through this fake Canadian business to give these right-wing podcasters money because they were spreading the kind of chaos and problems that benefit the Russians that weaken the United States. It's also nowadays with social media incredibly easy to you don't have to create the problem. You can just look at social media and see what are bad actors, what are things that are, people are attacking each other over, and you just push it. You push bots to push. There might be some person with 10 followers that says something horrible. All of a sudden, the Russians, now that guy's got 150,000 followers, and they're pumping that information in. So there's the useful idiots, like you said. There's people who they see might benefit them. They might give them money to talk on RT or on Russian television, or they push. These people are looking for something to get attention, and therefore they push narratives to them that they can use that spread their thing. And the Russians help on the back end by pushing their narratives on their citizens or through social media. And then there's the just pumping of social media, as well as trying to the old-fashioned, like, create a fake theory and push it through. So all of that goes on. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. Whatever sticks, that's great. You double down on that.
Yeah, because a lot of conspiracy theories that are very popular ultimately seem to be about sort of undermining trust in Western institutions. And I've always wondered to what extent Russia's responsible for the rise of conspiracy theory culture since the internet sort of took off. And I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Oh, yeah. The one thing I want to be careful with it because, conspiracy culture is something that's there anyway, and it grows anyway, and we have no way to really measure the Russian
Successes of that,
thing. And this was like the 2016 election. They certainly did everything they could to impact the margins in our voting, to sort of create problems and push right-wing theories and stuff. And so, but then of course there was a blowback from Trump people and others that said, people created this false Russian thing to say we are not legitimate. And it's true, there's no way to measure that, but it certainly was there, and it was certainly trying to do that. And so it's difficult. Like if you say that the Russians are doing things that are spreading conspiracies and are creating a political mindset among conspiracists, that's 100% true. But you don't know whether that is determinative and whether it's creating the problems you have. So I mean, somebody like Trump in Russia, they collude, whether they know it on purpose or not. They both have an interest in creating chaos and making people angry and using anger for political purposes and spreading false narratives and whatever. And so it's almost like these perfect people have found each other. The Russians can try to push in narratives and false stories into the Trump world and probably have some success, but those guys are going to do it anyway on their own thing. And so it's causing great damage to the U.S. polity and to things happening. Is it totally Russia? No, but Russia sees it, benefits from it. And as long as Americans are fighting each other, they're not focused on dealing with Russian threats. And so they want chaos. Trump is the chaos candidate. They're going to support Trump, but Trump's going to be the chaos candidate whether the Russians support him or not.
And what can journalists and the public maybe do better to distinguish between real accountability and disinformation, which may or may not be sort of designed to weaken confidence in U.S. intelligence and U.S. services?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things is listen and learn from allies and people who are closer to the problem. I think, Britain has suffered from some of this stuff in the Brexit thing and other areas. But, the Ukrainians and the Finns and the Swedes and the Baltic countries and the Poles and the Czechs, and they they understand it better. They seem to have policies and priorities that sort of push back better. You saw in Moldova, for example, the amount of incredible they invested huge resources into trying to go against the Western candidate in the recent Moldovan elections. They put disinformation, they put stories, they were created, fake dangerous things about immigrants, all sorts of stuff to make sure that the Western candidate lost and she won. And so a country like that, they were part of the Soviet Union. They know the game. They know what's happening. They seem to be more immune to it. Still, when we see it, we see a piece of information, we want to attack our domestic enemies. And so we tend to use it as ammunition I can use to attack a Democrat, or ammunition I can use to attack a Republican, rather than saying, I can attack my own political opponents without using Russian information or using the Russians to help us. And so hopefully we'll get more savvy with it over time and willing to listen to our allies. But right now we're in the midst of pretty ugly situation here in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And do you worry that persistent narratives about the deep state or CIA overreach could make it harder for the agency to do its job?
Absolutely. I think, I'm an institutionalist. I grew up inside an institution. I saw that it was manned largely by serious people who really cared about the health of the United States and the security of American population. We worked with foreign allies around the world, helping us on a variety of things. I think, go back to the Washington Post front page piece, I think American citizens, if they know the kind of people and the kind of work that happened inside the CIA and the FBI and the Defense Department and the NSA and all these places, would be proud of what they do. I mean, people take their work seriously. They work hard. They follow regulations and laws. So when politicians take on this, for their own partisan purposes, this story that there's a deep state that's trying to undermine political leaders, it's very damaging. I worked with friends like in all kinds of, in Asia and Africa and around the world, year after year on sensitive issues, and we never talked about politics in like the Republican Democratic sense. I had friends, I had no idea what their political view was until we left and I saw him on Facebook or something. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know he was
Yeah,
a right wing or left wing
yeah.
or whatever it is. It's about public service. It's about, you know, a, a mission of protecting the American citizens. So, yeah, undermining institutions to help you with your base politically is ugly and dangerous. And we're seeing it now in the FBI, like the talent is being pushed out the door. They're pushing out the counterintelligence people that focus on Russia, China, and all these disinformation things because the political party that's in power now actually benefits from this conspiracy stuff and all that. And so, yeah, I'm really, really scared. I think our institutions are a gem that Americans, if they understood them better, would support. But you can go the other way too, is have we done a poor job? Have politicians over the last years and people who led institutions done a poor job of making Americans understand the value of those institutions, right? I mean, I think we could have done a better job of making Americans understand what we do and why it's important than we have. That's why podcasts like this and all these other kind of things I think are important because it, gives a sense of what the reality is. And it's not always pretty, but I think if Americans understood it, they would support it more than they do.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, the more I've looked into the world of intelligence, the more I sort of realise its necessity and, have a slightly better understanding of it than I did when I started this podcast, which is, I think, a positive thing. Now, one last thing. So, you're involved with Hollywood and things, and Hollywood loves a good espionage story, kind of. And what could Hollywood sort of be doing better with espionage stories so not to play into these myths that become quite destructive in the real world?
Yeah, it's difficult because essentially intelligence and espionage films have become largely, the action film, right? And so it wants to be chasing and shooting and all these other kind of things. Whereas real espionage and real intelligence is slower burn. It's about relationships, it's about developing relationships. It's about those like innate human things of trust and betrayal and, all of those things. And frankly, great writers pick up on that and are able to use it. And I think Hollywood, if they would focus, they would see a lot of real stories about real characters and these real in-depth things. If they got out of the action genre for espionage and moved sort of more into like really delving into what makes someone tick, what are their motivations, trust and betrayal and those type of things. And so it's difficult because even sometimes, you work with film and Hollywood and stuff, and we get some writers, we spend a lot of time working with them and they sort of get it and invest and try to find a different way to tell stories. But then some will talk to them, will try to tell them our real world, and then they'll come back with pages that are just the same old stuff. It's like almost like cop stuff, It's like police things are great because it's just straightforward, arrest, shoot, whatever. But that's not our world.
No, it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult, and I think a lot of Hollywood producers are less concerned about authenticity and just want to excite people because, as you're saying, it's sort of this subgenre of action these days, which is unfortunate because I think it really is a great place for character studies, which is why the books of John le Carré are so good.
Yeah, they're great.
And the adaptations have been largely pretty good. There's been one or two bad ones, but most of them have been pretty good. Are there any shows or movies that you feel got close to getting it right or that you enjoy, regardless?
Yeah, people often ask that. There's not a lot that totally get it right, but there's a number of good ones. The one that is sort of closest to both the sort of how an intelligence service work bureaucratically and then in the field is the Bureau, the French series. The Bureau
great show.
Does a nice job, I think, of that. The Americans, the story about the Russian illegals in the 1980s America, is not accurate in the sense of all the murders on the streets and all this other kind of thing, but the play of tradecraft and working undercover and that it gets some of that right, and Russian use of those type of intelligence people where their kids don't even know that their parents are Russians is realistic and good, and I think they did a good job. Obviously, I love Slow Horses, sort of it's MI5, it's a domestic service, and it sort of plays on losers in that service, but it's just good entertainment, and it's not accurate, but there's sort of pieces of that are sort of fun. I'm trying to think if there's others. Those are sort of the ones that come to mind right now.
No, good choices. And I've always been a big fan of the film Spy Game with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. I think
that's really good.
Yeah, it's a good.
And what's the one in Iran where they? There's been a couple that take one operation and do it okay.
There is a show called Tehran that I'm still yet to watch on Apple that's about that. I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, that's okay. That's about Israeli operations in Tehran. But I'm just thinking of what's the movie where they have to get the Americans out of Tehran? Like it's
Argo. Argo. Yeah.
I mean, Argo is it makes some thing, but it's one operation, and they sort of describe it fairly well. And the same with like Zero Dark 30. There's some pieces of the reality of how that happened. Of course, compressed, and they often use one character to sort of cover a number of them. But it's something good. And Chernobyl is really good, but it's not intelligence, but like done a great kind of thing. So
yeah. So it's been great to finally chat with you. So thank you for joining me today.
Of course, my pleasure, and I appreciate what you guys are doing. It's kind of fun and important stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. And where can listeners find out more about you, your podcast, and other things too?
I used to be on Twitter, and I had a pretty big following, but I get too angry all the time, and I got angry at Elon Musk, so I got off of Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky, my true name. We have a company that's trying to make movies called Spycraft Entertainment. My podcast is called Mission Implausible, about conspiracy theories. And I tend to, when something comes up, I tend to write some. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic. There's some of these other places where I try to write pieces and things like that. So I don't know. I'm not heavily trying to market myself, but I do some of these other kind of things. And if people follow the podcast, that would be great.
Yeah, fantastic. Please do. Well, John, thanks again. It's been great chatting with you today. I hope we can do it again in the future. Thank you.
My pleasure. Of course.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.